Somalia and Turkey, what do they have in common historically regarding the forced displacement of civilians? When discussing Somalia, Turkey, and the history of forced displacement of civilians, it is important first to distinguish between two issues. The two countries do not have identical histories, and it would be inaccurate to claim that the events that occurred in Somalia and those that occurred in the territories of the Ottoman Empire or the Republic of Turkey were the same situation. However, there are historical and political similarities that can be examined in terms of how wars, state power, changing borders, and security policies have sometimes caused civilians to flee their homes or be forcibly removed from their communities. 1. What is forced displacement? Forced displacement occurs when civilians are compelled to leave their homes or places of residence because of war, violence, fear, government pressure, discrimination, or policies intended to alter the demographic composition of an area. It is important to distinguish between displacement caused by war. People flee because of conflict and insecurity. Displacement carried out by armed forces or armed groups. People are directly forced out of an area. Identity-based displacement, an ethnic, religious, clan, or social group is specifically targeted. Government resettlement, a government relocates people to another area, which may sometimes be voluntary but can also be coercive. Therefore, when comparing Somalia and Turkey, each event must be evaluated according to its historical period, who carried it out, why it occurred, and the legal circumstances surrounding it. 2. Turkey, a long history involving displacement and population transfers. The history of the territory that is now Turkey is particularly important when examining the final period of the Ottoman Empire and the establishment of the Republic of Turkey. During the wars and collapse of the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the early 20th century, large-scale displacements affected Armenians, Greeks, and other communities. One of the most controversial episodes occurred in 1915-1916, when large numbers of Armenians were ordered to leave areas where they had lived and were deported toward Syria and Mesopotamia. Historical sources document that these deportations were accompanied by killings, starvation, disease, and widespread deaths. This remains one of the most controversial and politically sensitive issues in the history of Turkey and Armenia. 3. The 1923 population exchange between Turkey and Greece. One of the clearest examples of a population transfer established through a formal agreement occurred in 1923. The Lausanne settlement provided for a compulsory exchange involving Greek Orthodox people living in Turkey and Muslims living in Greece. The relevant agreement explicitly referred to a compulsory exchange, and those affected could not simply return to their former countries without permission. This demonstrates an important historical point. Population displacement has not always occurred only through military attacks. In some cases, it was transformed into an official state policy and incorporated into an international agreement. Estimates vary, but the exchange involved hundreds of thousands of Muslims from Greece and more than 1 million Greek Orthodox people from Turkey and Anatolia. 4. Somalia. Displacement largely linked to war and state collapse. Somalia has a different historical experience from Turkey. Large-scale displacement in Somalia has been closely associated with internal conflicts, the collapse of the central government, clan-based violence, and armed conflict. Droughts and floods have also contributed significantly to displacement. A major example occurred during the conflicts in northern Somalia in the late 1980s. UNHCR documented that when forces of the government of Mohammed Siad Barre attacked cities such as Hargeisa and Barrow in 1988, hundreds of thousands of people fled to Ethiopia, while tens of thousands were displaced within Somalia. The civil war that began in the late 1980s and early 1990s, followed by the collapse of the central government in 1991, further expanded the displacement crisis. UNHCR reported that attacks and retaliatory violence in different parts of the country resulted in massive displacement, with by 1992 nearly 2 million people displaced from their homes, either internally or as refugees in neighboring countries. 5. Where Somalia and Turkey are historically similar. The most important similarity is not that their experiences were identical, but that political power, conflict, and security policies played significant roles in causing civilians to lose their homes. Several similarities can be identified. A. War and security can make civilians the primary victims. When a government or military enters into conflict with a group it considers a threat, civilians living in the affected area can sometimes become the first to flee their homes. In Somalia, this was particularly evident during the civil wars. In the territories of the former Ottoman Empire and later Turkey, particularly during periods of war and political transformation, large-scale population displacement also occurred. b. Social identity can become a basis for separating populations. In the history of Turkey in the late Ottoman period, religion and communal identity played an important role in the classification and treatment of populations. The 1923 population exchange explicitly distinguished between Greek Orthodox Christians and Muslims. Somalia's situation was different, but the civil wars were heavily influenced by clan, territory, and political affiliation. UNHCR has documented that retaliatory violence and conflicts involving different groups contributed to large-scale displacement. c. Land becomes part of the conflict. When people are removed from an area, the problem is not simply that someone has lost a home. It also raises questions about who takes control of the property, who is allowed to return, who controls the land, how does the demographic composition of the area change, what are the long-term political consequences. This is why displacement can have consequences that continue for generations. 6. But there are major differences. Despite these similarities, it would be incorrect to say that Turkey and Somalia have the same history of forced displacement. Turkey's history includes the final period of the Ottoman Empire, the Balkan Wars, the Greco-Turkish War, the transformation of the population of Anatolia, the establishment of the Turkish Republic, and the 1923 compulsory population exchange. Somalia's modern displacement crisis, on the other hand, has been primarily associated with military rule, the conflicts of the 1980s, the collapse of the central government in 1991, civil war, al-Shabaab, local conflicts, droughts, and floods. Therefore, the histories of the two countries must be compared while maintaining these important distinctions. 7. Somalia continues to deal with the legacy of displacement. Displacement in Somalia is not merely a historical issue. UNHCR has reported that Somalia continues to face conflict, political tensions, and climate-related disasters. In 2024, more than 550,000 people were newly displaced, adding to the millions who had already been internally displaced. This demonstrates that Somalia continues to face a displacement crisis driven by the combination of conflict, insecurity, land and political disputes, and natural disasters. 8. What can Somalia and Turkey learn from history? The most important lesson is that civilians should never be turned into instruments of political or military objectives. A government has the right to protect national security, but security measures should be based on 1. Protecting civilians and their property. 2. Prohibiting unlawful forced displacement. 3. Ensuring that military forces distinguish between civilians and combatants. 4. Allowing displaced people to return safely to their homes when conditions permit. 5. Preventing the use of military force to deliberately alter the demographic composition of an area. 6. Resolving land disputes through law and courts rather than through force. 7. Ensuring that political agreements do not treat civilians as objects to be exchanged, relocated, or sacrificed. Conclusion. Historically, Somalia and Turkey do not have identical experiences of forced displacement, but both histories contain examples demonstrating how war, state power, social identity, and territorial politics can contribute to large-scale displacement. For Turkey, important examples include the events surrounding the final years of the Ottoman Empire and the 1923 compulsory population exchange between Turkey and Greece. For Somalia, major examples include the displacement caused by the 1988 conflicts in northern Somalia, the collapse of the central government after 1991, the subsequent civil wars, and the continuing displacement caused by conflict, insecurity, drought, and floods. Therefore, when discussing Somalia and Turkey today, the most important question is not simply who historically displaced civilians, but rather, how can we ensure that the mistakes and tragedies of the past are not repeated in the name of security, politics, war, or state interests? History teaches us that when civilians lose their homes, land, and the right to live safely in their communities, the consequences do not end on the day they are displaced. Such displacement can create political, economic, and social wounds that continue for generations.